She lived in this house her entire life and was sure she knew everything about it. After her husband's death, an elderly woman accidentally discovers a hidden staircase beneath the floor. What was hidden below completely changes how she sees the man she lived with for decades. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The house had never felt empty before. It had known silence, yes, and long evenings when the radio was turned low and the wind pressed softly against the windows, but emptiness was something else entirely. Emptiness arrived only after the funeral, when Evelyn returned alone and closed the front door behind her, hearing the sound echo through rooms that no longer answered back. The echo lingered longer than it should have, as if the walls themselves were uncertain whether they were allowed to settle into stillness. That morning, the house woke before she did. Pipes shifted inside the walls with dull, tired sounds. The floorboards sighed under the change in temperature, and somewhere, deep beneath the structure, something contracted and released, a sound so faint it might have been imagined. Evelyn lay still in bed, staring at the ceiling she had stared at for decades, noticing for the first time how unfamiliar it looked without the soft rhythm of her husband's breathing beside her. She rose slowly, not because her body demanded caution, but because her mind had not yet accepted that there was no one else to wait for. The kettle was filled out of habit, the mug placed on the counter exactly where it had always been. She opened the curtains, letting gray morning light spill into the living room, illuminating furniture worn smooth by years of use. Every object seemed to hold its position with quiet determination, as if it had been instructed never to move again. This house had been her entire adult life. She had crossed its threshold as a young woman with tired hands and cautious hope, and now she stood in the same place with silver in her hair and a weight in her chest that felt heavier than any box she had ever carried through the door. It was not a large house, never had been, but it had grown into something vast through memory alone. Every room contained layers of time, pressed together so tightly that she could feel them beneath her skin. The house had survived storms that had torn branches from the old oak in the yard. It had endured summers when the heat settled thick and unmoving, and winters when the cold crept through the walls no matter how carefully the windows were sealed. It had seen laughter and arguments, illness and recovery, months of worry when money was scarce and years of cautious comfort when it was not. It had held them together when the world outside had been less forgiving. Evelyn moved through the kitchen, touching the back of a chair as she passed, steadying herself more from memory than from need. Her reflection in the window startled her, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it looked unfinished, like a photograph taken before the subject was ready. She had always thought of herself as part of a pair, even when she was alone in a room. Now she felt outlined against the glass, defined by absence. Of all the rooms in the house, there was one she had avoided since returning from the cemetery. The door remained closed, just as it had been for most of her marriage. Her husband's workroom had always existed on the edge of her awareness, present but unexamined. It was not forbidden in words, but it had been sealed by habit and respect. He had asked for privacy there, and she had given it without question. He had built that room with his own hands. She remembered the months of hammering and measuring, the careful way he reinforced the floor and insisted on a particular arrangement of shelves. He had worked late into the evenings, often emerging with sawdust on his sleeves and a distant look in his eyes. When she asked what he was building, he had always answered simply that it was something necessary. Necessary had been enough for her. Over the years, the room had become part of the house's rhythm. He would enter it in the early mornings or long after sunset, sometimes staying for hours, sometimes only minutes. He kept the door locked, though never in a way that felt secretive. It was merely closed, contained, controlled. She had trusted him the way she trusted the foundation beneath her feet, without inspecting it, without imagining that it might hide something unexpected. Now, standing alone in the hallway, Evelyn found herself facing that closed door. The hallway clock ticked loudly, each sound measured. She told herself she was only going to clean. That was all. Dust accumulated when rooms were left untouched, and dust had a way of settling into corners like a quiet accusation. She could not leave his things to decay. Order had always been her answer to grief, a way of reminding herself that the world still obeyed certain rules. When she opened the door, the smell of old wood and machine oil drifted out, unchanged by time. The room looked exactly as it had the last time she had glimpsed it from the doorway months earlier. The heavy desk stood against the far wall, its surface mostly clear except for a few carefully arranged tools. Cabinets lined one side, each closed, each labeled only in his mind. A single narrow window let in a pale strip of light that did little to soften the shadows. The floor was covered by a thick, dark rug, its fibers flattened where his chair had rested for years. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and felt a strange shift in the air, as though the room existed slightly apart from the rest of the house. The sound of the clock faded, replaced by a muffled stillness that pressed gently against her ears. She moved slowly, touching the edge of the desk, running her fingers along the smooth wood. Her husband had been a careful man. Everything here had a place, even if that place was known only to him. There were no family photographs, no personal mementos on display. This room had not been for memory. It had been for purpose. As she bent to straighten the edge of the rug, a sensation crept through her shoes that made her pause. The floor beneath her felt colder than the rest of the house. Not cool in the way shaded rooms sometimes were, but distinctly cold, as if it belonged to a different environment entirely. She shifted her weight, stepping back, then forward again. The feeling remained. She frowned, pressing her foot more firmly against the rug. The chill was localized, confined to a small area near the center of the room. She dismissed it at first, assuming it was her imagination, the product of nerves and exhaustion. But as she stood there, she realized that the cold had been present before. Not often, and never long enough to concern her, but enough that it stirred something uneasy in her memory. She knelt, smoothing the rug back with care. Beneath it, the wooden floor looked ordinary at first glance, polished and well-maintained. Yet, something about it felt wrong. The grain ran slightly off from the surrounding boards, subtle enough that it would have escaped notice unless one was looking directly at it. Evelyn placed her palm flat against the wood. The cold seeped into her skin immediately, sharper than before. She drew her hand back, startled, and sat there for a long moment, her heart beating faster than it had any reason to. This house had never surprised her. It had aged, yes, and required repair, but it had never revealed anything unexpected. The realization unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She stood and crossed the room, checking the window, the walls, the radiator beneath the sill. Everything appeared intact. No drafts, no moisture, no obvious explanation. When she returned to the spot and pressed her foot against it again, she noticed something else. The sound was different. Not hollow exactly, but muted, as if the floor were layered over something that absorbed the impact. A quiet unease settled into her chest. She straightened, glancing at the closed door as if expecting it to open on its own. The house remained silent, offering no guidance. She thought of the years she had spent trusting that everything important in her life was visible, accounted for, shared. The thought that something might have existed beneath her feet, unnoticed, unacknowledged, made her feel suddenly unsteady. She told herself she would leave it for another day. There was no reason to investigate now. She had lived here for decades without incident. Whatever it was, it could wait. Yet, as she replaced the rug and moved toward the door, the sense of being watched lingered, not by another presence, but by the room itself, by the space she had finally entered after so many years. The workroom felt less like a place of labor and more like a boundary she had crossed too late. She turned back once more, her gaze drawn to the center of the floor. The cold waited patiently beneath the wood, unchanged by her hesitation. Somewhere, deep within the house, something shifted again. A faint sound. Evelyn rested her hand on the doorframe, feeling the solid reassurance of the house she had trusted for so long. For the first time since her husband's death, she allowed herself to consider a thought that frightened her more than loneliness. The possibility that the man she had loved, the life she had shared, and the home she believed she knew might all contain layers she had never been meant to see. She closed the door gently, but the question followed her into the hallway and remained with her as she returned to the quiet routines of the morning. The house did not offer answers. It only held them, buried deep, waiting for the moment she would no longer be able to turn away. The question Evelyn carried out of the workroom did not leave her when she closed the door. It followed her through the hallway, into the kitchen, and lingered as she rinsed her cup and placed it carefully in the sink. The house resumed its ordinary sounds, the faint ticking of the clock, the distant hum of electricity inside the walls, yet something had shifted. The workroom was no longer a sealed space in her mind. It had opened, and with it came a sense of unfinished business she could neither name nor ignore. She tried to return to routine, because routine had always been her way of surviving change. She wiped down counters that were already clean, folded laundry that did not need folding, rearranged small objects on the shelf near the window. Each action was deliberate, precise, almost ceremonial. Yet beneath every movement was an awareness that something waited for her, patient and unmoving, under the floor of the one room she had never truly entered before. By the afternoon, the memory of the cold spot beneath the rug had sharpened rather than faded. She replayed the sensation in her mind, the unnatural chill that had seeped through the soles of her shoes and into her skin. The house had always been predictable. When it was cold everywhere. When it was warm, warmth spread evenly through its modest frame. That isolated pocket of cold had no place in her understanding of the structure. She returned to the hallway outside the workroom several times, pausing as though she had forgotten something important and was trying to remember what it was. Each time she told herself she would deal with it later. Each time the later felt less convincing. As daylight began to thin, Evelyn stood once more before the closed door. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she rested her hand against the wood, feeling its familiar texture, the faint grooves left by decades of use. Her husband had passed through this doorway thousands of times. Whatever lay beneath the floor had been beneath his feet as well. The thought carried a strange comfort and an even stranger unease. She opened the door and stepped inside. The room greeted her with the same controlled stillness, the same filtered light. She closed the door behind her and crossed directly to the center of the floor, pulling back the rug with more confidence than before. The wooden boards beneath were clean and well maintained, no sign of rot or neglect. If anything, they looked newer than the surrounding floor, as though they had been replaced at some point. She pressed her foot down again. The cold was undeniable. It radiated upward, distinct and localized, as if it belonged to a space not meant to share the same air as the rest of the house. She knelt slowly, careful of her knees, and placed her palm against the wood once more. The chill was immediate, biting in a way that made her draw a sharp breath. Her eyes traced the outline of the boards. Now that she was looking closely, she could see the difference. The seams were finer, the nails fewer and set deeper. This section of floor had been crafted to blend in, not to be noticed. The realization made her heart beat faster, not with fear exactly, but with the weight of discovery. She stood and moved to the cabinets along the wall, opening them one by one. Inside were tools she recognized and others she did not, their purposes unclear. Measuring instruments, old levels, spare hinges, sealed containers labeled only with dates. Everything was arranged with intention, nothing left to chance. Her husband had not been careless. If there was something beneath the floor, it had been planned. Evelyn retrieved a small flashlight from one of the drawers, turning it over in her hands. It was heavier than expected, solid and well used. She tested it, and a strong beam of light cut through the dimness of the room. The sight of it filled her with a quiet resolve. She had spent a lifetime adapting to circumstances she had not chosen. She returned to the cold spot and knelt again, examining the edge of the board closest to her. There, barely visible unless one knew to look, was a narrow seam, cleaner than the rest. She pressed her fingernail into it and felt a slight give. Her breath caught. This was no accident. This was an entry point. It took time to work the board free. She moved carefully, aware of her age and the risk of sudden strain. Using one of her husband's tools, she applied slow, steady pressure, coaxing the wood upward rather than forcing it. The sound of the board lifting was soft but unmistakable, a gentle protest that echoed too loudly in the quiet room. When the board finally came loose, she lifted it away and set it aside. Beneath it was darkness, deeper than the shadowed corners of the room, a darkness that seemed to absorb the beam of her flashlight rather than reflect it. She leaned forward, shining the light down, and gasped softly. A staircase descended into the earth. The steps were narrow and steep, constructed of reinforced wood and metal, disappearing into a space that lay completely hidden beneath the house. The air rising from below was cool and dry, carrying a faint smell of dust and something older, something sealed away for a long time. Evelyn remained still, her mind racing to catch up with what her eyes were telling her. There had been no mention of this in any of the paperwork when they bought the house. She remembered that process clearly. They had been careful, methodical, reviewing every plan and record they could find. The house had been old even then, but honest, or so she had believed. She sat back on her heels, her heart pounding in her ears. This was more than a quirk of construction. This was a deliberate concealment. Her husband had known. He must have. The thought carried a sharp edge that cut through her grief, leaving behind a hollow ache. For a long moment, she considered covering the opening again and walking away. She could replace the board, lay the rug back in place, and tell herself that some things were better left alone. She had lived well without knowing this secret. She could continue to do so, but the image of the cold beneath her feet refused to leave her mind. Whatever lay below had been close to her for years, sharing her home without her awareness. The boundary between ignorance and knowledge had already been crossed the moment she lifted that board. Evelyn rose slowly and left the room, returning moments later with a sweater, a bottle of water, and her phone. She slipped the phone into her pocket, knowing the signal might not reach wherever the stairs led, but unwilling to leave it behind. She tested the flashlight once more, adjusted the beam, and took a steadying breath. Standing at the edge of the opening, she looked down the stairs. The light revealed only the first few steps, solid and well-built, before the darkness swallowed them. Her body protested quietly, reminding her of stiff joints and slower reflexes, but her mind was clear. If she did not go now, she would never stop thinking about what lay beneath her home. She placed one foot onto the top step. It held firm. She shifted her weight, gripping the edge of the opening with one hand as she descended another step. The air grew cooler with each movement downward, brushing against her skin in a way that made her shiver despite the sweater. The house above seemed to recede with every step, its familiar sounds fading until there was only the soft echo of her own movement and the steady beam of the flashlight cutting through the dark. She descended slowly, counting each step without meaning to, grounding herself in the rhythm. When her feet finally touched solid ground, she paused. The space she stood in felt separate from the rest of the house, insulated not just by earth and wood, but by intention. The air was still, undisturbed, as though it had been waiting for her arrival. She lifted the flashlight and let its beam sweep across the room. What she saw made her breath catch, not with fear alone, but with astonishment. The space beneath her home was not a rough crawl space or an unfinished cellar. It was a room, purpose-built and carefully maintained. Shelving lined the walls, holding boxes and containers arranged with the same meticulous order she had seen upstairs. A table stood near the center, its surface clear but for a thin layer of dust. The floor was smooth, free of debris, and the walls bore no sign of dampness or decay. This place had been used. Not briefly, not accidentally, but deliberately, over a long period of time. Evelyn took a cautious step forward, her shoes making a soft sound against the floor. The dust shifted slightly, disturbed in a way that suggested more than just her own movement. She frowned, lowering herself to examine it more closely. In certain areas, the dust was thinner, brushed aside in patterns that did not match the. Someone had been here. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with temperature. She straightened, her flashlight sweeping the room again, more carefully this time. The room was small, contained, but it held more questions than she could count. Whatever her husband had hidden beneath their house, it was not merely an extension of his workroom. It was something else entirely, something that demanded explanation. Evelyn stood at the bottom of the stairs, surrounded by silence and shadow, aware that the house above her continued on as it always had, unaware of her descent. She had crossed a threshold she could not uncross, stepped into a space that rewrote the history of the life she thought she knew. As she moved deeper into the room, the flashlight revealing more with every step, she understood that this was only the beginning. The cold beneath her feet had not been a warning meant to keep her away. It had been an invitation, waiting patiently for the moment she was finally ready to accept it. Evelyn remained still for several seconds after stepping fully into the room, as if her body needed time to accept that the space truly existed. The stairs behind her felt unreal now, like a narrow seam between two different lives. Above her was the house she had known for decades, with its worn furniture and familiar rhythms. Here, beneath it, was something untouched by daily routine, preserved in deliberate isolation. The air was cool but not damp, carrying a dry, faintly metallic scent mixed with old paper and wood. It reminded her of archives she had once visited long ago, places where time was stored rather than lived. She lifted the flashlight higher, letting the beam move slowly across the walls, careful not to rush, as though moving too quickly might disturb something fragile. The room was smaller than the workroom above, yet it felt more intentional. Every inch of space served a purpose. The walls were reinforced, smoother than she expected, and the corners were sharp and precise. Along one side stood a row of shelves built directly into the structure, each holding boxes of varying sizes. Some were cardboard, others metal, all sealed and neatly arranged. The uniformity unsettled her more than chaos would have. Disorder could be explained by neglect. This could not. She took a few cautious steps forward, her shoes leaving faint impressions in the thin layer of dust that coated the floor. The dust was evenly spread in most places, undisturbed and fine, suggesting long periods of stillness. Yet, as she moved deeper into the room, she noticed areas where the dust had been brushed away, not recently enough to reveal footprints, but recently enough to suggest repeated movement. The marks were subtle, almost respectful, as if whoever had passed through here had been careful not to leave too much behind. At the center of the room stood a sturdy table, on its surface bare except for a thin film of dust and a single folded cloth placed neatly at one corner. Evelyn reached out and touched the edge of the table. The wood was cool and solid beneath her fingers. This was not furniture meant to rot in darkness. It had been chosen, placed, and used. She circled the table slowly, the beam of the flashlight following her movement. Against the far wall stood a tall metal cabinet, its surface dull and scratched, bearing the quiet scars of age. A simple lock held it closed, the kind that required a key rather than a code. Nearby, a small stool rested beneath a shelf, its legs worn unevenly, as though it had been dragged back and forth countless times. Evelyn's gaze moved upward, following the shelves. Each box was labeled, but not in any way she immediately understood. Some bore dates written in her husband's familiar handwriting. Others had only numbers or short combinations of letters that meant nothing to her. There were gaps in the sequence, deliberate spaces left empty, as if waiting for something that had never arrived or had been removed. She stepped closer to one of the shelves and gently ran her fingers along the side of a box. The cardboard was thick, reinforced, designed to protect its contents from moisture and time. She hesitated before lifting the lid, feeling the weight of the moment press against her chest. This was no longer about curiosity alone. Whatever she uncovered here would reshape the memory of the man she had loved. She opened the box carefully. Inside were stacks of paper wrapped in brown string, arranged with meticulous care. She loosened one bundle and unfolded it, revealing documents that looked official, their edges yellowed with age. Names, dates, addresses. Some were familiar, belonging to places she recognized from their past. Others were completely foreign. There were copies of letters, typed and handwritten, their contents hidden from her by the angle of the flashlight. She set the papers back in the box and closed it, her hands trembling slightly. One discovery at a time, she told herself. She could not absorb everything at once. Moving along the shelves, she found other boxes filled with photographs. She lifted one photograph carefully, brushing away dust. It depicted a group of people standing together in front of a building she did not recognize. Her husband stood among them, younger than she remembered him ever being, his posture alert, his expression serious in a way she had rarely seen at home. The people around him were strangers, their faces marked by tension rather than celebration. Evelyn studied the photograph for a long moment. She had no memory of it, no story to attach to it. Her husband had never mentioned these people, yet the image felt important, not like a casual snapshot, but like documentation. She replaced the photograph and moved on, her heartbeat steady but heavy. Another box contained cassette tapes, each labeled with dates spanning several decades. Some labels were smudged, others carefully rewritten, as though he had returned to them repeatedly. She did not have a device to play them here, but their presence alone spoke volumes. These were records, testimonies, voices preserved in darkness. On a lower shelf, she found something that made her pause. A small canvas bag lay tucked behind larger boxes, almost hidden. She pulled it forward and opened it. Inside were personal items that did not belong to her husband, a worn wallet containing an old identification card issued to someone else, a child's bracelet, faded and frayed, a folded piece of fabric that looked like it had once been a part of a uniform or work clothes. Evelyn felt a tightening in her chest. These were not mementos collected out of sentiment. They were evidence of lives intersecting with his in ways she had never imagined. She straightened and stepped back, her flashlight sweeping the room once more. The realization settled slowly, but with undeniable clarity. This room was not a hiding place for valuables. It was a repository of responsibility. Whatever her husband had been involved in, it had extended far beyond the walls of their home, far beyond the quiet routine she had shared with him. Her attention was drawn to the metal cabinet again. She approached it cautiously, her footsteps soft against the floor. The cabinet loomed taller than she had first realized, its top nearly reaching the ceiling. She ran her fingers along the edge of the lock, then searched the room with her eyes until she spotted a ring of keys hanging on a hook near the stairs. She hesitated, then crossed the room and lifted the keys. There were many, each slightly different, their surfaces worn smooth by repeated use. She tried one in the cabinet lock. It did not fit. The second key turned halfway, then stopped. The third slid in easily and turned with a soft click. The sound echoed in the small room, louder than it should have been. She opened the cabinet door slowly. Inside were metal drawers, each sealed with its own latch. She pulled one open and found more documents, these newer, their paper crisp despite the dust outside. Some bore official seals. Others were handwritten notes, dense with information, cross-referenced and annotated. Her husband's handwriting filled the margins, precise and controlled. Evelyn's eyes scanned a page, and she felt the ground shift beneath her understanding. These were not personal notes. They were records of events, movements, actions taken and actions avoided. There were references to meetings, to transfers, to people being moved from one place to another under cover of anonymity. Names appeared, then disappeared, replaced by codes. She closed the drawer, her breath shallow. The room felt smaller now, its walls pressing inward with the weight of what they contained. She stepped back, nearly stumbling, and caught herself against the table. As she steadied herself, something else caught her eye. On the floor, near the table, the dust was thinner, swept aside in a rough arc that suggested frequent movement. She knelt again, shining the flashlight closer. The pattern was not random. It traced the path between the table and the cabinet, back and forth, worn into the floor over time. This room had been used regularly. Not long ago. A sudden sound reached her ears, faint but unmistakable. A soft creak high above her. Evelyn froze, her flashlight beam trembling slightly as she lifted it toward the ceiling. The sound came again, followed by a subtle shift. Someone was in the house. Her heart pounded as she stood, every sense alert. She listened, straining to catch more, but the sounds were distant, muffled by layers of wood and earth. It could have been the house settling. It could have been her imagination. Yet the timing felt wrong. She took a slow step toward the stairs, then stopped. If someone was upstairs, returning suddenly could be dangerous. If they knew about this room, about what it contained, her discovery might not be as private as she believed. She switched off the flashlight for a moment, plunging the room into darkness. In the absence of light, the space felt even more sealed, more secretive. She waited, counting her breaths, listening. The sound did not repeat. Evelyn turned the flashlight back on and took one last look around the room. Her eyes fell on a single object resting on the table, partially hidden beneath the cloth she had noticed earlier. She lifted the fabric and felt her breath catch. Beneath it lay a document holder, its surface worn and creased. Inside, visible through a transparent sleeve, was a photograph she recognized instantly. Her husband stood beside another man, both facing the camera. The other man's face was unmistakable because Evelyn remembered seeing it once, years ago, in a newspaper article about a tragic incident that had ended in death. According to the article, the man had not survived. Yet here he was, standing alive beside her husband. Evelyn lowered herself into the chair by the table, the photograph resting in her hands. The implication was impossible to ignore. The man she had loved, trusted, and mourned had been part of something that reached into histories that had been officially closed. He had not simply kept secrets. He had rewritten outcomes. Another sound echoed faintly from above, closer this time. A door, perhaps. Or a step. Evelyn rose, her movements slow but decisive. She returned the photograph to its place and covered it again, her mind racing. She had come here seeking understanding. What she had found was a reality that no longer fit within the quiet life she remembered. She climbed the stairs carefully, replacing the board and rug as best she could, her hands moving on instinct. When she emerged into the workroom, the air felt warmer, heavier, as though the house itself were holding its breath. She stood in the center of the room, listening. The house was silent again, offering no confirmation of the disturbance she had heard. Yet she knew with certainty that nothing would ever feel the same. As she closed the workroom door behind her, Evelyn understood that the hidden room beneath her house was not merely a secret of the past. It was an unfinished story, one that had not ended with her husband's death. And whether she wished it or not, she had just become part of it. Evelyn did not sleep that night. When she lay down, the ceiling above her seemed farther away than it had ever been, as if the house had grown taller while she was not looking. Every sound carried weight now. The soft settling of the walls, the distant creak of wood cooling in the night air, even the faint rustle of leaves outside felt charged with meaning. She listened, not as someone drifting toward rest, but as someone standing watch. Her husband's image would not remain still in her mind. It shifted constantly, rearranging itself around the fragments she had uncovered beneath the house. The man she had known had been quiet, patient, deliberate. He had loved routine, respected privacy, avoided unnecessary conflict. He had been gentle in ways that never announced themselves. Yet, the man in those photographs, the man whose handwriting filled pages of coded notes and careful records, carried a different weight. That man stood at the center of events she had never imagined touching their small, contained life. When dawn finally came, it brought no relief. The morning light revealed the same rooms, the same furniture, but Evelyn moved through them like a guest rather than an owner. She made tea and forgot to drink it. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at the grain of the wood, tracing patterns without seeing them. Her thoughts returned again and again to the hidden room, to the cabinet, to the photograph of a man who should not have existed anymore. By mid-morning, she accepted that avoidance was no longer possible. The moment she had stepped into that room, she had crossed from not knowing into responsibility. Whatever her husband had done, he had chosen to leave it behind in a way that ensured it would be found. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not easily, but inevitably. And now that it had been uncovered, it demanded understanding. She returned to the workroom with a steadiness that surprised her. The fear had not vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the sharp edge of shock, but a deeper, quieter tension, the kind that comes from realizing that one. She closed the door and stood for a moment, listening. The house remained still. Only then did she move the rug aside and lift the concealed board, her movements practiced now, almost reverent. The stairs awaited her, unchanged. She descended slowly, the flashlight steady in her hand, until the hidden room opened around her once more. This time, she did not linger at the threshold. She moved directly to the table and set the flashlight down, adjusting it so that it illuminated the surface clearly. One by one, she brought out the items she had glimpsed the night before, arranging them carefully as though setting the stage for something that required order. She began with the documents. She unfolded them slowly, reading not everything at once, but enough to begin forming connections. Names repeated across different years. Addresses changed, sometimes crossing state lines, sometimes disappearing altogether. There were references to assistance, to protection, to relocation. Certain phrases appeared again and again, written in her husband's precise hand, as though they carried significance beyond their surface meaning. As the hours passed, a pattern began to emerge. This was not random charity, nor was it simple record-keeping. Her husband had been involved in something sustained, organized, and deeply intentional. He had helped people vanish from one version of their lives into another, not to escape justice, but to escape danger. The realization unsettled her more than the secrecy itself. She had lived through decades when danger did not always announce itself openly. She knew what it meant to navigate a world that could turn hostile without warning. Yet, she had believed those threats belonged outside their door, not woven quietly into the foundation of their home. She paused when she came across a series of documents tied together with a faded ribbon. These were older than the rest, their paper thin and fragile. As she read, her chest tightened. They referred to an incident long past, one she remembered faintly from news reports years ago, a violent event, a wrongful accusation, a death that had been accepted publicly as unavoidable. Yet here, in these pages, the story fractured. The man in the photograph, the one officially recorded as dead, appeared again in these documents, referenced under a different name. There were notes about false identification, about safe passage, about a promise made and kept. Her husband's handwriting grew heavier in these sections, the strokes more deliberate, as though he had pressed harder against the paper. Evelyn leaned back in the chair, closing her eyes. Memory rose unbidden. She recalled her husband returning home late during that period, quieter than usual, his shoulders tense. She had asked if he was all right. He had nodded and said he was tired. She had believed him. She had always believed him. The workroom above suddenly took on new meaning in her mind. His insistence on privacy, his careful control over certain parts of the house, his refusal to let anyone else handle specific repairs. What she had taken for a desire for order now revealed itself as something closer to vigilance. As the day wore on, she moved from documents to photographs, studying faces, expressions, locations. None of the images felt celebratory. There were no smiles, no casual poses. These were records, taken to confirm presence, to document moments that might later need proof. She recognized her husband's posture in each one, the way he stood slightly apart, attentive rather than central. There were also absences, gaps in the sequence that troubled her. Entire years with fewer records, as though something had happened that could not be written down, even here. The emptiness felt deliberate, more telling than the pages that existed. Late in the afternoon, she heard a sound above her again. This time, it was clearer. A soft thud, then the faint scrape of something being moved. Evelyn froze, the paper in her hands trembling. She listened, holding her breath. The sound did not repeat, but the silence that followed felt strained. She gathered the documents and returned them to their places with care, extinguishing the flashlight before climbing the stairs. When she emerged into the workroom, she scanned the space quickly. Nothing appeared disturbed. The door remained locked, the windows untouched. Yet the sensation of being observed lingered, a thin pressure against her awareness. She locked the workroom door behind her and moved through the house, checking each room methodically. Everything was as she had left it. No drawers open, no objects out of place. Still, she could not shake the certainty that the house had. The thought followed her into the evening, into the quiet preparation of dinner she barely tasted. She found herself glancing at the windows, at the front door, at the hallway leading to the workroom. The house had always been a shelter. Now it felt like a boundary between past and present, a place where different truths coexisted uneasily. As night settled in, Evelyn sat alone in the living room, the lamp casting a small circle of light around her. She held one photograph she had not returned to the hidden room, the image of her husband standing beside the man who was not supposed to exist. She studied her husband's face carefully, searching for something she had missed all those years. There was no triumph there, no pride, only focus, determination, and something else she recognized now as resolve shaped by necessity rather than choice. For the first time since his death, Evelyn allowed herself to feel anger alongside grief, not loud, not explosive, but deep and steady. Anger that he had carried this alone. Anger that he had decided for her what she could and could not know. Anger that her life, carefully constructed on trust, had rested atop secrets heavy enough to reshape it entirely. Yet beneath the anger was another feeling, one that surprised her with its persistence. Respect. Not blind admiration, but a sober acknowledgement of the cost of what he had done. He had not sought recognition. He had not spoken of it. He had built a room beneath their house and filled it with truth, then sealed it away, carrying the weight in silence. As the night deepened, Evelyn came to understand something essential. Her husband's secrecy had not been about hiding from her, it had been about protecting her. Whatever dangers he had navigated, whatever enemies his actions might have created, he had kept them from touching her life as long as he could. But he was gone now, and the protection he had maintained through silence had ended with him. Evelyn rose and extinguished the lamp, standing in the darkness of her living room. The house felt different, not hostile but altered, like a familiar landscape revealed under new light. She knew now that the hidden room beneath her feet was not a relic of the past. It was an unfinished responsibility. And somewhere within the carefully ordered chaos of her husband's secret work, there were threads left untied. Whatever he had been working toward, he had not lived long enough to see it completed. The realization settled heavily in her chest. She had not sought this knowledge. She had not wanted this role. Yet, as she stood there, listening to the quiet breathing of the house, Evelyn understood that the story beneath her home did not end with her husband's death. It had merely changed hands. Evelyn woke before sunrise with the sense that something had shifted again, not in the house this time, but within herself. The quiet that greeted her no longer felt passive. It felt expectant, as if the walls were aware that she had reached a point beyond reflection. The anger and understanding she had carried through the night had settled into something heavier and more focused. It was no longer enough to know what her husband had done. Knowledge without action felt like another form of abandonment, and she knew, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was what she could not accept. She moved through the house slowly, methodically, preparing breakfast she barely touched. Each familiar motion anchored her, even as her thoughts turned again and again to the documents beneath the floor. Her husband had not simply recorded events for memory's sake. The precision of his work, the careful cross-referencing, the way certain files were marked and separated, all suggested intent beyond documentation. These were not archives. They were tools. By mid-morning, she found herself back in the workroom, the door closed behind her, the rug drawn aside with practiced ease. The stairs no longer frightened her. They felt almost inevitable, like a path she had always been walking without knowing where it led. She descended once more, her flashlight steady, her breathing controlled. In the hidden room, she went directly to the cabinet. She opened the drawers she had only briefly examined before, this time with patience rather than shock. She laid the contents out across the table, grouping documents by date and by subject. As she did, a clearer picture emerged, one that tightened her chest with its implications. There were cases her husband had marked as resolved. Those files ended cleanly, with final notes written in a decisive hand. Relocation completed. Threat neutralized. Identity secured. But there were others, fewer in number yet heavier in presence, that lacked such conclusions. These files ended abruptly, sometimes with a single line written later than the rest, as though added in haste. Delayed. Unfinished. Evelyn traced one of these notes with her finger, feeling the indentation left by the pen. Her husband's writing here was different, less controlled. The letters pressed deep into the paper, betraying tension. She imagined him standing in this very room, weighing options, calculating risk. The realization that he had not been able to complete what he started unsettled her more than the danger itself. She continued sorting, and among the unfinished files she found something that made her pause. A folded envelope, thicker than the others, sealed and unmarked. Inside was a letter written in her husband's hand, dated only weeks before his death. It was not addressed to her by name, yet as she read she understood it had been meant for her all along. He did not apologize. He did not explain everything. Instead, he wrote about responsibility, about the way certain choices, once made, could not be undone without causing greater harm. He wrote about protecting people who had already lost too much and about the limits of time. He acknowledged, without sentimentality, that there were matters he would not finish himself. The words were spare but deliberate. If this reaches you, then you have found what I could not bring myself to share. There are things that cannot be passed on through conversation. They must be discovered. Trust your judgment. Do not rush. And remember that silence can protect, but only for so long. Evelyn folded the letter carefully and set it aside. The weight of it settled fully into her awareness. This was not a confession. It was a transfer. As the hours passed, she followed the threads left behind, reading deeper into the unresolved cases. She learned that at least one person mentioned in the files was still alive, still at risk. There were recent annotations written within the last year of her husband's life, noting increased activity, renewed interest from parties unnamed. He had been watching, even as his health declined. The implications were sobering. Whatever danger existed had not died with him. It had simply gone dormant. A sudden sound above her pulled her sharply back into the present. This time it was unmistakable. A door closing, not slamming, not forceful, but deliberate. Evelyn's heart began to pound. She extinguished the flashlight instantly, plunging the room into darkness, and stood motionless, listening. The house above creaked softly, settling. Footsteps did not follow. No voices reached her ears. After several long minutes, she allowed herself to breathe again. Whether someone had been there or not, the effect was the same. She could no longer assume privacy. When she climbed back into the workroom, she moved quickly, replacing the floorboard and rug with care born of urgency. She checked the locks on the doors, peered through the windows, scanned the yard. Everything appeared unchanged, but the sense of exposure clung to her like damp clothing. That evening, she received a call she had not expected. It was from a distant relative, someone who had shown little interest in her or her husband before. The voice on the line was polite, almost overly so, expressing concern, offering help, asking questions about the house, about paperwork, about whether she had found anything of importance in her husband's things. Evelyn answered cautiously, keeping her responses vague. When the call ended, her hands were shaking. It was no longer paranoia. People were circling. That night, Evelyn sat alone at the kitchen table, the unfinished files spread before her. She understood now that there were only two paths forward. She could hand everything over to authorities, trusting systems her husband had clearly chosen not to trust fully. Or she could continue as he had, quietly, carefully, protecting those who still needed protection while ensuring the truth did not fall into the wrong hands. The decision weighed heavily, but it did not feel impossible. Her husband had not chosen her at random to inherit this burden. He had known her strength, her patience, her ability to endure quietly. He had trusted her to act without spectacle. She spent the next day preparing. She made copies of the most critical documents, storing them separately. She identified one name among the files that appeared repeatedly, someone her husband had contacted near the end, a former lawyer, now retired, someone who understood discretion. She wrote a letter, careful and measured, requesting a meeting without revealing too much. She mailed it herself, choosing a postbox far from her neighborhood. At home, she changed the locks. She rearranged furniture in ways that allowed her to hear movement more clearly. She placed subtle markers on doors and drawers, small signs only she would notice if something had been disturbed. These were not the actions of fear alone. Late one afternoon, as she returned from the store, she noticed a car parked farther down the street than usual. It was nothing overt, nothing that could be proven suspicious. Yet it remained there longer than it should have. When she glanced again later, it was gone. The message was clear. Time was narrowing. That evening, she returned to the hidden room and gathered the most dangerous materials, those that could cause harm if misused. She studied them carefully, weighing each piece. Some information could save lives, other information could destroy them. The responsibility of deciding which was which pressed against her chest until it was difficult to breathe. In the end, she chose restraint. She prepared to pass on what was necessary and to eliminate what was not. This was not an act of erasure, but of protection, mirroring the logic her husband had followed. As she sealed the box containing the most sensitive items, a sound echoed above her again. This time, it was unmistakable. Someone moving with intent. Evelyn froze, the box in her hands. The threat she had sensed for days was no longer abstract. She extinguished the flashlight and stood in the darkness, her heart pounding, aware that the unfinished business beneath her house was no longer safely contained by secrecy alone. Whatever forces her husband had kept at bay were stirring. And she knew, with chilling certainty, that the choices she made next would determine whether his work ended in quiet resolution or catastrophic exposure. The night after Evelyn sealed the box in the hidden room did not pass quietly. Even when the house appeared still, she sensed movement in the margins of her awareness, as though the world beyond her walls had begun to press inward. Sleep came only in fragments, broken by dreams that dissolved the moment she opened her eyes, leaving behind a lingering sense of urgency. By morning, exhaustion had sharpened into resolve. There was no longer any illusion that time was on her side. She rose before dawn and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky lighten slowly over the trees. The street outside remained empty, yet she felt certain she was no longer invisible. Her husband's work had always relied on discretion, on being overlooked. Now that the hidden room had been disturbed, that invisibility was gone. The truth carried weight, and weight attracted attention. Evelyn did not panic. Panic wasted energy. Instead, she began to act. She returned to the hidden room while the house was still quiet, moving with a confidence that would have surprised her former self. The stairs no longer represented fear or mystery. They were simply a passage between two responsibilities. In the room below, she opened the sealed box again and laid out its contents one final time. Each document, each photograph, each recording represented a choice her husband had made, often at personal cost. Now, those choices belonged to her. She began by separating what could protect from what could destroy. Some files contained information that, if released without care, would expose people who had already risked everything to survive. Other files documented wrongdoing that had never been addressed, crimes hidden beneath official conclusions and forgotten headlines. The distinction was not always clear, and that ambiguity weighed on her more heavily than any single threat. As she worked, she felt her husband's presence not as a ghost, but as an echo of intention. She recognized his restraint in the careful phrasing of notes, in the way certain names were shielded behind codes even here. He had not been trying to control the future. He had been trying to give it room to unfold without unnecessary harm. Evelyn decided then that she would honor that principle above all else. She gathered the files connected to the most immediate danger and prepared them for transfer. Copies were made, sealed, and stored in places only she knew. She wrote brief summaries in her own hand, careful to preserve accuracy without revealing more than necessary. These were not confessions. They were lifelines. Late that afternoon, she received a response to the letter she had sent days earlier. The retired lawyer agreed to meet, providing a neutral location and a time that suggested discretion. Evelyn felt a flicker of relief, quickly tempered by awareness. Each step forward increased visibility. Still, retreat was no longer possible. On the day of the meeting, she left the house earlier than necessary, taking an indirect route. She was careful not to be followed, yet she did not allow suspicion to turn into paranoia. The meeting passed quietly. She spoke only of what was essential, handing over select documents and explaining their significance without dramatization. The lawyer listened, asked few questions, and accepted the responsibility with visible gravity. When Evelyn returned home, the front door was closed, locked as she had left it, yet the air inside felt disturbed, as though it had been recently displaced. She moved through the house slowly, her senses alert. In the living room, a cushion sat at a slightly different angle. In the kitchen, a drawer she never used stood open by a fraction of an inch. Someone had been inside. The realization did not frighten her so much as it clarified the stakes. Whoever was searching for something believed it was here. They were not acting randomly, they were narrowing in. Evelyn did not call the police. She understood too well how easily information could travel beyond intended boundaries. Instead, she moved methodically, checking her markers. Several had been disturbed, subtle signs that confirmed what she already knew. The hidden room itself, however, remained untouched. Either they had not found it, or they had not yet dared to open it. That night, she did not stay in the house. She packed a small bag, took the most sensitive materials with her, and left under cover of darkness, driving until the road grew unfamiliar. She spent the night in a place her husband had once used as a temporary refuge for others, now empty and forgotten. Sitting alone in that borrowed safety, she felt the full weight of what he had built and the cost he had accepted as inevitable. The following days blurred into careful movement and controlled action. Evelyn coordinated quietly with the lawyer and with one additional contact she had identified from the files, someone who understood the balance between exposure and protection. Together, they arranged for critical information to reach the right hands, ensuring that it could not be buried again, but also could not be exploited recklessly. There was resistance. Not open threats, but pressure. Inquiries framed as concern. Suggestions that she rest, that she let others handle things. At one point, a stranger approached her in public, offering assistance that felt more like assessment. Evelyn declined politely and made sure she was never alone afterward. The climax came not in violence, but in confrontation. One evening, as she returned to her house for what she knew would be the last time before everything changed, she found someone waiting inside, not hiding, not threatening, but standing openly in the workroom as though claiming the space. The person spoke little, but their presence conveyed intent clearly enough. They wanted what her husband had hidden. They believed she would give it up to avoid trouble. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When the moment came, she told the truth, carefully and without emotion. The most dangerous information was no longer here. It had been copied, distributed, protected by systems far larger than either of them. What remained in the house was no longer leverage. The realization unsettled the intruder. They left without further confrontation, understanding that the game had shifted beyond their control. In the days that followed, the pressure eased. News surfaced quietly, not as a scandal, but as a correction. Old cases reopened, names re-examined. People long presumed lost reappeared under new identities, protected by time and distance. The process was slow and deliberate, unfolding without spectacle. Evelyn watched it from a distance, allowing others to carry the public weight. Her role was nearly complete. Before closing the final chapter of her husband's work, she returned to the hidden room one last time. She stood there in silence, surrounded by the remnants of a life lived partly in shadow. She felt no bitterness now, only a sober understanding of the cost of choosing to act when silence would have been easier. She destroyed what needed to be destroyed, preserving only what had meaning beyond danger. When she was finished, the room felt lighter, as though it, too, understood release. As she climbed the stairs and sealed the floor above, Evelyn knew she had paid a price for truth. It had taken her certainty, her illusion of simplicity, and replaced them with something harder but more honest. She had lost the comfort of not knowing. In return, she had gained clarity. The house above her waited, unchanged in structure but transformed in purpose. The work was finished. The danger had passed. And for the first time since her husband's death, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that what remained was not fear, but legacy. When the last door closed behind the people who had come and gone in the weeks that followed, the house finally grew quiet again. Not the tense, watchful quiet that had filled it before, but a deeper stillness, one that settled naturally into the walls and floors, as if the building itself had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Evelyn felt the change immediately. She stood in the hallway one morning, sunlight slanting across the worn wood, and realized that for the first time since the world outside had moved on in subtle ways. There were no dramatic headlines tied directly to her name, no sudden crowds at her door. Instead, changes unfolded slowly, deliberately, as she had hoped. Old cases were reopened without spectacle. Quiet corrections appeared in official records. People who had once existed only as fragments in her husband's files were absorbed back into the flow of life, protected not by secrecy alone, but by time and distance. The truth had not exploded outward. It had settled into place, reshaping the ground beneath it. Evelyn followed these developments from afar, reading between lines, recognizing patterns invisible to most. She did not feel pride in what she had done. Pride felt too loud, too sharp for something that had required such restraint. What she felt instead was a sober peace, the kind that comes only after a long, difficult obligation has been met. The house seemed to recognize this shift as well. The strange tension that had lingered in certain rooms faded. The workroom no longer felt sealed or guarded. When Evelyn entered it now, it was simply a room again, filled with tools, light, and the faint scent of wood. The cold beneath the floor had vanished entirely, as though whatever had drawn it there had finally been resolved. On a clear afternoon, she decided it was time to return to the hidden room one final time. She moved with familiarity now, pulling back the rug, lifting the concealed board, descending the stairs without hesitation. The space below greeted her differently than before. The shelves were mostly bare, the cabinet nearly empty. What remained were items she had chosen deliberately, not out of necessity, but out of meaning. A few documents preserved for historical truth. A handful of photographs kept not as evidence but as memory. The rest had been destroyed or transferred, their purpose fulfilled. She stood in the center of the room and let herself take it in fully, not as a site of danger or secrecy, but as what it had always been at its core. A place built to protect. A place meant to hold weight so that others would not have to. Evelyn knelt and ran her hand across the smooth floor. She felt no chill this time, only the steady, neutral temperature of earth and stone. The house above her felt solid, grounded, honest. For years, she had lived on top of this room without knowing it existed. Now she understood that the foundation of her life had always included layers she had not been aware of, and that awareness did not diminish what she had lived. It deepened it. She gathered the remaining items and placed them carefully into a single container, one that would remain sealed unless needed again. Then she turned to the room itself. She cleaned it thoroughly, not to erase its past, but to honor it. Dust was swept away, surfaces wiped clean. The room grew brighter, lighter, no longer burdened by the weight of secrets alone. When she was finished, Evelyn stood at the base of the stairs for a long moment. She thought of her husband as he had been here, working quietly, carrying knowledge he could not share, making choices that shaped lives beyond his own. She felt neither anger nor sorrow now, only a clear understanding of who he had been in full. Not a hero, not a martyr, but a man who had accepted responsibility when it would have been easier to look away. She climbed the stairs and replaced the board for the last time. This time, she sealed it completely, reinforcing it not with haste, but with care. The hidden room would remain, not as a secret waiting to be uncovered again, but as a closed chapter, preserved and protected by intention rather than concealment. In the days that followed, Evelyn began to change the house above. Not dramatically, not as a renovation meant to erase the past, but as a quiet rebalancing. She opened curtains that had long been kept half closed. She rearranged furniture to invite light and movement. She brought plants into rooms that had felt stagnant, their green leaves catching sunlight and softening corners that had once seemed too sharp. The workroom changed the most. She removed nothing essential, but she altered its purpose. The heavy desk remained, but she placed a chair by the window, creating a space for reading and reflection. The cabinets stayed, but their contents shifted, now holding ordinary tools, papers, and books. The room was no longer defined by what was hidden beneath it, but by what it allowed her to do now. Evelyn found herself spending time there in the evenings, not working in the way her husband had, but thinking, writing, sometimes simply sitting and listening to the house breathe around her, the silence. She did not speak often of what she had discovered or what she had done. Those who needed to know already did. For everyone else, the story remained simple. A woman who had lost her husband and continued to live quietly in the house they had shared. That truth was not false. It was simply incomplete, as all truths were. From time to time, she received messages passed discreetly through channels her husband had once used. Short notes of gratitude, confirmation that someone was safe. Proof that what had been protected remained protected. Each message reinforced her belief that legacy was not something declared or displayed, it was something sustained. The house settled fully into its new state as winter approached. Evelyn prepared it as she always had, sealing windows, checking insulation, ensuring warmth would reach every room evenly. When the first cold night arrived, she noticed with a faint private smile that the floors were warm everywhere, including the place where the hidden room lay beneath. The imbalance that had once drawn her attention was gone. One evening, as she sat alone with a cup of tea, she allowed herself to remember the life she had lived with her husband in its entirety. Not just the quiet years, not just the moments of comfort, but the complexity she had only come to understand after his death. She realized then that she did not need to forgive him or justify him. Understanding was enough. She had lived her life believing that strength was loud, that change came through force or confrontation. What she had learned beneath her own floor was something different. That endurance could be quiet, that responsibility could be carried without recognition, that doing what was right did not always leave visible marks on the world, but reshaped it all the same. When she finally rose to turn out the lights, Evelyn paused in the hallway above the sealed entrance. She placed her hand against the floor, feeling its solid warmth, and closed her eyes. The house held her steady, as it always had. The secrets beneath it were no longer secrets. They were legacy, settled into place, no longer demanding discovery, only respect. And for the first time in a long while, Evelyn slept without listening for footsteps, certain that what had been hidden had served its purpose, and what remained was finally, fully her own. If this story kept you watching until the end, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. They only get deeper. Watch our other videos to uncover more hidden secrets and untold truths. And share this video with someone who loves